What then is the significance of nationalization of the banks? Only by nationalizing the banks can the state put itself in a position to know where and how, whence and when millions and billions of rubles flow.
Hello, listeners. Ansel here, back with Kent, the master of macromelange, and we are doing our episode number 6 on the Communist Manifesto. So Kent, how are you doing?
Not too bad. We've had a little hiatus here. My parents were in town, so we actually went to Pella, Iowa, if you're at all familiar with. It's kind of like a Dutch town. And that was nice. We caught a nice fall day where the foliage was really pronounced. Yeah, but back at it, ready to go. And this is going to be quite a meaty episode. But anyway.
I'm looking forward to it because, a lot of us talk that are interested in this type of stuff. We talk about socialism and we talk about, the way the market works, et cetera, et cetera. And I just remember when I was in high school, I was friends with an exchange student from Dresden, Germany, and she was pretty much a communist. Even though this was after the wall fell and everything, her family was hurt a lot by the dissolution of the Communist Party in East Germany. So she gave me a copy of the Communist Manifesto back in high school, and, I thought it was always good to know the other side, because even back then I was an Austrian and I was a free market guy. And so I think it's always good to know the other side. And I think that's what we're going to try to do here is talk about the other side and then maybe relate it to why it's wrong and all that, right?
Yeah, we really just want so like in the current times, we're constantly told that capitalism as a quote unquote system is failing us, and it's responsible for the large wealth gaps that are always advertised in different periodicals, things such as the CEO to average worker pay gap and so forth. And so, in this episode, we'll focus on just the U.S. primarily. And we'll use the 10 planks of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto to try and, determine if the U.S. Truly is a quote-unquote capitalist nation, or if it's far more Marxist in character. So I think that, first of all, I don't think many people have actually read the Communist Manifesto. Mm-hmm. So that, or even reading any literature on capitalism or understanding what it is. So we're going to try to kind of demystify that this episode.
All right. So let's jump into it. What do you have for us first?
Okay. So there's 10 planks, and some of them, it's not really apparent if they apply or don't apply, to what's going on today. But before we get started, I'm going to just read each one so that the audience is familiarized with all 10 of them. And okay. I'll just go through this quickly. The first one is the abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Number 2 is a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Number 3 is the abolition of all rights of inheritance. Number 4 is the confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. And that's immigrants with an E, just for the listeners. And number 5 is the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Number 6 is the centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Number 7 is the extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Number 8 is equal liability of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Number 9 is combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the populace, over the country. And finally, 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production, et cetera, et cetera. So we're basically going to touch on some highlighted, a couple of the planks here as opposed to all of them. And actually, I didn't put it in the notes, but this first one, abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes, it just came to my mind. I mean, isn't that what state parks and government, the government basically partitions huge parts of the land of land in the United States to themselves, do they not?
Yeah, I think it's about a third. It's about a third, I think, of all land in the United States is public land. So that is a pretty large percentage, and we're on our way there. That makes me think of the what is it called? Eminent domain. So
Mm-hmm.
when they want to build a road somewhere, a public road, they can seize your property, and they also they pay you what they think is a fair market value, which it totally is not. I've had a family member that had a little piece of marginal land, and they confiscated it for a freeway or a freeway extension,
Mm-hmm.
and that marginal piece of land was a moneymaker because it had a billboard and a cell tower on it. So he was making a good amount of money from that, and they paid him like a third of what it was worth, really. And so they can just take it and they can tell you whatever they want. So I think that is in full flower, this abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. This the plank number one. I think this is well on its way.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think a lot of people have seen there was a lot of kind of hoopla around the high-speed rail in California,
Hmm.
and the way in which that was developed is they more or less eminent domained the farmers in the Central Valley of California. And I distinctly remember in one case, so these farmers have these big plots of land, and let's say they have a cattle ranch. The rail would go right through the middle. Well, this is all grazing property, so it would be up to the farmer to build a tunnel under the would-be tracks so that the cows can go to both sides of the land. So because it effectively split the land. I
Hmm.
don't know what they paid the farmers for the land or how they paid them out. I know there's stuff sitting in the courts today based on them not paying and stuff like that. But in addition to just reappropriating the land, they also created a literal obstacle for the cattle so that the farmer had to spend out of pocket to build a tunnel or something, or under the high-speed rail line so that the both sides of the pasture could be used for grazing, stuff like that. And of
Yeah.
course, famously, the high-speed rail is no longer going to exist. It failed. It's billions and billions of dollars that have just been wasted
A
for this
boondoggle.
project. Huge boondoggle. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's brings up another fact here that is very bad for the environment in general. So it's not only bad for the people, and they don't ever own property in that sense because it can always be seized. The wildlife, not just the cattle, but all sorts of wildlife that used to transit that area is hurt by this. So any sort of environmentalist should be totally against this type of power from the government.
So, did you have anything else on this first one? Or are you ready to move on to number two?
Well, real quick, what about water rights
Sure.
there in California?
Uh,
Are you familiar with that?
I don't know. There's a lot of water rights issues in California just due to the scarcity of water. I mean, they do stuff out there like they build aqueducts. It's really poor planning because huge population centers exist in like San Francisco and the Bay Area, but they have these huge aqueducts and like canals that basically pull water out of the mountains and like pump it down to these desert regions. So I mean, it's like they're very far from the source, so it's very expensive to transport the water.
Hmm.
But all in all, I can't really comment too much on that. I haven't gotten too into it.
Okay.
So
All right. Well, let's go
yeah.
to plank two then.
Okay, this is a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Let's see. The first chart that we have, I want to specify, people focus a lot on marginal tax rates, and that is kind of silly in my opinion. Effective tax rates are what you actually pay overall. And so that's kind of what I tried to focus on here because it's actually really hard to kind of dig for this information. But the first one here is just that shows the average effective tax rate on the top 1% of households. And since, you obviously hear the 1% versus the 99% narrative being pushed, I figured we'd use that for this episode.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you can see, the Federal Reserve was chartered in 1913, and with that came income taxes. And the chart basically goes back to that point. And so you can see that the effective tax rate on the top 1% was 13, 14%, at the beginning, 1913, 14. And it looks like it peaked at 40. Well, this chart seems to show higher than 45% sometime just after World War II. And it has gone down a little, but it's still at about 37%. So, it's more or less kind of plateaued at a higher level. From the beginning of the progressive era was basically, the early 1900s, more or less. And so they kind of got their wish, right? I mean, you're getting a really high tax on the wealthiest 1% of households, according to this data from the Tax Foundation.
Yeah, graduated tax income. This makes me think of the Laffer Curve, and I can bring this in here, is that this was, if you lower taxes, you actually increase the revenue to the state because, the economy expands. And so 37% of a lot is more than 45% of a little. And so that's kind of the idea behind the Laffer curve. So I can see them just looking at this chart. It kind of wiggles around slightly down from the 1950s, and that might be in relation to this idea, that the income is actually increasing, and even though the effective tax rate is going down.
Like it sounds like what you're kind of talking about, the Laffer curve, is like where there's a fine line where taxes get too high, it strangles the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that kind of fine line that sits somewhere at a point, if you will.
Right. Yeah. It's to maximize government revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the taxes are too high, you're actually hurting the economy too much versus whatever. But another thing that this makes me think of is it's now been bred into us, right? That there's nobody alive that remembers an effective tax rate of 15%.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes normal to us. And I notice this a lot when I get into discussions with people, is they just have this inability to imagine a world with fewer taxes.
No taxes if it's before 1913. No income taxes anymore.
Yeah, or no taxes. It's been bred into us. And this is a very short period of time, actually. If you zoom out 1,000 years, I mean, the effective tax rate for thousands of years was in the single digits.
Even for debts for serfs, I believe.
Yeah. And so this is just an aberration of history. And I think it has to do a lot with fiat, but we'll get into that here later, I think.
Yeah. So the next one we have here, just on this same topic, it's a list. Unfortunately, this doesn't give you the effective tax rate, but it does show the brackets.
Mm-hmm.
And as you go back, decade by decade, you'd have to inflation adjust a lot of these numbers.
Mm-hmm.
But since we do know pretty much the effective tax rate today, if we scroll all the way back down here to, let's see, it goes way back. In fact, I think we have some weird Civil War era stuff in here too. But I mean, here we are back in the 1860s, and there only exists a marginal tax. There's only a single marginal tax rate, which makes it much more easier to just see there was only a 5% tax over $1,000. So what
Hmm.
$1,000 was in 1867 is vastly different than what it is today. But notwithstanding, you're looking at a 5% tax rate. That's it, for people that make 1,000 or over, and no taxes effectively for people that made under that. The highest marginal tax rate I see here, 1864, which would have been at the worst part of the Civil War, that's 10% was the highest marginal tax rate. And it looks
And
like 18.
$10,000 back then, like what you're saying, $10,000 is like 200 or 300,000 at least, right?
Yeah,
No,
it's a lot of
probably even
money.
more. Yeah, it's probably even more than that. Maybe $500,000.
Right. And so it's really helpful, but I mean, we don't have any the top marginal tax. This is during wartime and then during Reconstruction.
Hmm.
And even during that time, the highest marginal tax rate was again 10%. So I think it's pretty safe to say that this progressive or graduated income tax has been with us for a long time and is a reality, and that is again a Marxist principle.
Yeah. Well, then it goes
So
back. I'm looking. This is an interesting PDF here. So then going into the late 1860s, it goes back to flat at 5%. 1870 goes down to 2.5%. And that's only if you made over 2,000 a year, which in today's money would be like at least 100,000, probably. Um,
yeah, if you hold on, I can inflation adjust. Try to inflation adjust real quick. I don't know. Getting those numbers from back then would be probably pretty challenging. You can maybe use the gold. That'd be a rough estimate. Yeah, I'm looking here. Just a quick Google, and inflation calculator only goes back to the beginning of the Fed. It doesn't take us back to that. But we do know that gold was $20 an ounce. And
mhm.
so let's see, $4,000. I mean, that's what, 200 ounces of gold?
Yep.
So 200 ounces of gold, it's at what, $1,500? So wait, we get 200 times 20 times 15. That'd be $60,000 today.
So if you made over 60, then you would be paying 2%.
And that's on a manipulated gold price today. So it's actually
Right.
probably more than that. So
Right.
um,
That's very, very interesting. And then, of course, we see then in 1913, when the Fed started, we get a major graduated, like out of the blue, this is a major graduated tax rate.
yeah, exactly. So and then as you go, I mean, by 1917, World War One, you've got 67% brackets. 50,
Wow.
they've really muddled the tax system and made it much more opaque and far more complicated to understand, which is what we're used to today.
Well, yeah,
Yeah,
but
good.
this, so 2 million, this is in 1917, $2 million or more of income, which is ridiculously high. I mean,
That's ridiculous. Yeah.
that's like 100 million or more today. And 67%. Nobody that was making that much would be paying this, right? I mean, you can hide your money, you can evade taxes. So, anyway.
And a lot of it was probably in company shares or ownership of companies. I don't
Holy
know who would
cow.
make that kind of money back then in straight income, because even today, I mean, the billionaires don't, the majority of their quote unquote wealth is in stock, not in actual income that they draw. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Holy cow. In 1918, 77% was the highest. Wow.
yeah,
That's
and a
pretty
million
crazy.
dollars would be a huge, huge amount of money
Hmm.
back at that time. So,
Okay. So, where are we going then with this next?
okay, the next one on this topic is this is kind of cool. If you click on this, this is a Quartz has one. This is from back in 2013, but it's still applicable today because, again, we've had a plateau for kind of quite some time where we've had a permanent plateau of much higher effective tax rates, than we had, a century ago and so forth. And
Hmm.
so basically what you can do is you can take a given value of money in today's dollars and you can plug it in here and it'll
Hmm.
show your effective tax rate. And you can very clearly see after the 40s, there is a huge bump up. But it's
Hmm.
not, you hear the narrative of tax the wealthy type of thing. But if you look at this, yes, they do get hit. I mean, let's put in like I forgot what it is to be in the top 1%, but you put in like $500,000 and you see that from 1940 to about 1990, their effective tax rates hit like they were at 50% for a long time. And they've plateaued down, but they're still their effective tax rates are still in the 30%, 30 to 40 percentile. However, if you chop off one of the zeros and just put 50,000 in, they kind of try to sell it like, oh, it's just going to be a tax on the wealthy. Well, I'm looking at this and the effective tax rate of people making basic household, and I think the basic household income today it's $56,516. So that's the average household income. And as you can still see in 1940, that got jacked up. So they've been just more or less sitting either above 20% or just under, whereas in the 1930s, they were at 4%. So this whole narrative of the rich will do all the heavy lifting doesn't seem to work out in practice, and it usually trickles down to the proletariat, if you will, having to pay a big sum of their income as well.
Yeah, this is an interesting chart. I like it.
Other than that, those are kind of the three things we had on plank number 2. Did you have anything else to add, Ansel, before we move on?
So I guess just to state up to this point, we've gone through plank number 1, which was the abolition of private land into public land. And then plank 2 was progressive or graduated income tax. And so if we were kind of ranking these, is the U.S. fit in with these two planks? I would have to say yes, both of them. I mean, more into number 2 here, this progressive or graduated income tax, but also the abolition of your private land. We're well on the way, right?
Oh, absolutely. So to your point with the heavy progressive or graduated income tax, what's not even factored in here are things like sales tax, tax on gasoline. There's all sorts of other taxes that could be compiled in a comprehensive study that would show that huge bulk of your income in some way, shape, or form goes to taxation, and that, as you obviously make more, it continues to climb. But overall, see this, this one, again, they sell it a progressive graduated income tax. So we're going to go after the wealthy. But, what it boils down to is everybody, paying significantly more in taxes. And so, in my opinion, yes, this fits the definition quite well.
Okay, let's go on to number 3 here.
All right, number 3, the abolition of all rights of inheritance. In this country, we don't really use the term inheritance. We use the term the estate tax. This one is a little bit more challenging because you need an inflation adjuster too, but I wanted to put it up here anyway. They've screwed up the link on this one. Sorry, Ansel, I'm scrolling through to find this.
No worries. While you're looking at that, let's just get through number 5, and then we can do the other 5 in another recording, because then it'll just get too big for me and too long to edit.
Okay, that's not a problem.
All right.
There's a good point, because it's like estate taxes. I mean, it's something like half of your wealth if you don't put it in a trust.
Yeah, death tax.
Yeah, exactly, death taxes. So the only big point I wanted to bring up with the abolition of rights of inheritance, we don't have outright abolition. However, what we do have is a situation where the death taxes are very high. They're like 50% or something, and they can go up with the size of the estate and so forth. And so what bothers me about that personally is the fact that, so your whole life you've paid income taxes, sales taxes, blah, 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 and you've managed to save X amount of dollars. And then upon your passing, they bilk you for another 50% or whatever the percentage is, based on. And so it's really it's double taxation. We don't have 100% abolition of rights of inheritance, but we definitely have a large portion of inheritance basically gets taken unless you go through the proper channels to basically try to avoid that. I think setting up a trust or something. So
unless you have asymmetric knowledge and you are already rich and you know how the system works and you know how to use the system properly, then you can get around some of these things. And again, it hurts the little guy. It hurts that guy that has been saving up his money and he dies and he has $100,000 in the bank. He wants to give it to his kids. And instead of them being able to start a business with it or do something else, the government takes at least 50% of it. So, yeah, I can see this is definitely hurting the little guy. And as a socialist thing, I mean, I would just take that percentage. I would say the U.S. is 50% of this plank because there
Certainly.
is a death tax of 50%. And so, for sure, we are 50% of plank number 3.
I don't have anything more to add on that, so I'm going to move on here. We're actually just going to touch on the bold points. So again, number 4 is confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. We're not going to touch that on this episode. We're going to move straight to number 5,
Okay.
which is the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. And I'm actually going to read a quick quote to you here, Ansel, or actually to the listeners. This is from 1917 in the midst of the Bolshevik Revolution, and this is from Lenin. It goes, what then is the significance of nationalization of the banks? Only by nationalizing the banks can the state put itself in a position to know where and how, whence and when millions and billions of rubles flow. And only control over the banks, over the center, over the pivot and chief mechanism of capitalist circulation would make it possible to organize real and not fictitious control over all economic life, over the production and distribution of staple goods, and organize that, quote, regulation of economic life, which otherwise is inevitably doomed to remain a ministerial phrase designed to fool the common people. Only control over banking operations, provided they are concentrated in a single state bank, would make it possible, if certain other easily practicable measures were adopted, to organize the effective collection of income tax in such a way as to prevent the concealment of property and incomes, and I added this part here, ostensibly due to the ability of the national bank to keep track of who receives the money because they're the ones emitting everything.
Yeah.
And then at the end he said, for at present, the income tax is very largely a fiction. Ansel, any thoughts on that? Sorry, it was large and heavy, but...
No, that's interesting. I've never read that, and that is pretty damning. Of course, are we going to get into that's exactly what we have today?
Well, when I was reading this, just to help it along, it's like it just reminded me of the cashless society that they've been pushing. They want to control they want to know where every dollar is at, or every euro or every krona at all times. And that's exactly what 102 years ago he is essentially advocating here. 100% complete control of the money system can only be done by having a national bank that emits currency and has the monopolistic privilege of doing so.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I agree with that. And this is right at the time of the Fed, right? And
Yep.
I don't know. You made me think that there is a dichotomy here. And even back at this time, we see the seeds of fascism versus communism. And where Lenin is saying that the state needs to run the bank so that they can control everything and invade your privacy. And there is no such thing as privacy in monetary or fiscal matters. What we have here is this quote unquote private central bank in the Fed. And that is a fascistic idea. So the private Fed is protected by the state, but it itself is actually private and they can do whatever they want. And so I can see the seeds here right away at the beginning of these central bank experiments that it was a fascist idea versus a communist idea.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, I have a term I've kind of coined called two-step socialism, which is basically just in practice what you just described. The Federal Reserve has a symbiotic relationship with the government. through itself and its shareholders, there's like a requirement to buy government bonds because the
Hmm.
government's always perpetually, amplifying their debt. So there is a symbiotic relationship. It's a bit more opaque than what you would have under a Lenin's system or a Marxist system, and that you do have that private bank, and you do have the government. They are separate, but not really. So all in all, it's pretty close. Fascism, socialism, they're awfully close in practice.
Yes, except fascism would be that the elites are not subject to a vote. And I guess in communism, they're not really subject to a vote anyway, because it's all fake, right? There's one political party, and they say here are two nominees, pick between them, but they already know who's going to win, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe, yeah, they're both a massive government idea.
For the sake of plank number 5, I would say that this has been pretty well done. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state. I mean, really, the Treasury basically just outsourced its money function to the Fed.
Mm-hmm.
So they made that choice, and ultimately, to me, this has been a pretty much the nails in the coffin, so to speak. This is a Marxist type of setup that we have in this country and have had since 1913. I don't know. Would you agree, or would you say it's maybe a degree less?
I think it's a degree less, but it is at least 50% of the way there, because I see it more as a fascistic thing than a communist thing. But they, like we have been saying here, they're very closely related. There's kind of just a few little minor definitional differences. And so, yeah, I can see we're at least 50%, if not 75% of the way to a full communistic central bank. I also, this made me think of the fact that, the Russian central bank, when the Soviet Union fell, wasn't the central bank of Russia, it became owned by like the Rothschilds and stuff. And that was one reason why Russia didn't take off, was because they were still penalizing Russia through the banking system. I could be wrong here, but do you know anything about that?
I don't know anything about that, though. I have heard that the current woman that's in charge of the Russian central bank is indeed like an operative of the West,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that she was educated in the West, and so she's a kind of like a neo-Keynesian. She's arbitrarily keeping rates higher than they otherwise would be, which is restricting the loan mechanism. So there are viable enterprises over there, but they can't borrow at those high rates.
Yeah.
So there's like an artificial kind of squeeze happening on their economy. But I'm not too well versed in it, so I don't really want to go too much more into it than that.
Yeah, I
So
remember this was 2 or 3 years ago when the ruble crashed like 20% in a single day. It was an attack by the West, and it was through the banking system. So yeah, that's interesting. It almost makes me think that the difference here is between fascism and communism is more nationalistic, where fascism is more globalistic. What do you think about that?
uh, you'd have to expand on what you mean by those two terms.
Well, so like the banking families, they run the banks in the U.S. and in Europe and in Russia and in Israel and everywhere, basically. And so they are kind of like an outside of the state apparatus, but they're global. So they're like a global government. They're a global monetary government. And where a communist central bank would be more of a state communist or state run
Like Venezuela,
thing.
basically.
Yeah, yeah. But I don't
Yeah.
know, that Venezuelan central bank might be owned as well by these Rothschild people, and they're just taking it out on them. If they liked the United States, Venezuela would be right back to its living standard probably in a generation. But the bankers are taking it out on the Venezuelans because they are against the Western oil companies and things like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the current banking system is very, very close to full-blown communism because there is no function by which the market can determine what money is. All there
Hmm.
is a single source of quote unquote what money is. And all the only difference is there's a country by country basis, or you've got the Eurozone which has the euro, but there's a single bank. It's perhaps private, but it's surrounded by the government. It does the government's bidding in terms of buying bonds and manipulating interest rates and so forth. And again, it forces citizens to use its cheapened money as the only source of money out there. So there's no market mechanism to determine what money is. There's no real industry in banking or anything anymore. It's all just heavily controlled. So to me, my position is just that we're basically again two-step socialism. We're right there at the doorstep of what Lenin and statists that share his opinions, Marx and so forth would have wanted. Yeah, those are my I guess closing thoughts on plank number 5. You got anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, I think we're going to hold off on the next 5 of these and do a whole nother episode. But as a closing thought, I'll go first on this first half, and then I guess you can go after that. It almost seems to me like communism was, and I've studied this for a long time, and I don't remember. I've forgotten 95% of what I've read about all this stuff, but what strikes me is that communism was aimed at these elites. When it mentioned capitalists, what it was talking about, or what Marx was talking about, were the elites that we know today as like globalist elites.
Who
So
are statists in their own right?
yeah, but they're kind of like above statism, I think. So he was looking at these central bankers, the people that are in charge of the central banks and that are above the law. And he was like, we need to get rid of those people. And then those elites were like, oh, well, that's an interesting little theory you have. Go ahead. And then they won. They just instituted a lot of these communist policies in all of these countries, tricking the people into thinking that they were doing something, but in reality, the elites were just above everything. And they look, they're bankers today. They're still above the law. They're above nationalism. They're above the states, and they can do whatever they want as bankers with their little tendrils and everything. So that's kind of what I'm thinking here.
Well, that just goes to my theory that there's a symbiotic relationship between the elites that you speak of and so things like socialism, fascism, even though we're talking specifically about Marxism here, those are just so easily for them to co-opt to their own purposes.
Yeah.
Because they are the best at the game of top-down governance, centralization of power. Like that's their wheelhouse. That's what they do. So when you're just offering them additional, theory or whatever to aid them in what they're already good at, they're just going to take that and use it to their purposes.
Mm-hmm.
It's just made so much easier by these mechanisms of centralization. So,
yeah, almost like if you look at the 19th century, you had the breakup of the monarchies and things, and these powerful aristocrats and the powerful nobles, and that was existential threat for them, I think. And they went ahead and welcomed the nation state because they were able to control it from a banking perspective. And if you look at the Central Bank of England and the Rothschilds and all of these things, they became I know there's a word for it. It's like a extra national, where they are above the nations and they are lending people money, and they don't care who wins because they're going to lend money to both sides, sort of thing. And so they just moved from outright the Habsburgs and being monarchs. Now they are bankers and they control the world in that respect. What do you think about that?
yeah, well, you just reminded me of I know it's a controversial topic, but I think it was Nathan Meyer Rothschild in the Battle of Waterloo, and
Hmm.
how what is it? He had a messenger that beat word back that the British had won, and he started mass selling to trigger a panic and so forth. But they were funding both sides because they had outlets in both Paris and London, so they're going to win either way. And kind of the cleverness of the situation that they set up, I believe, in the late 18th century. I don't really have much more to add than that.
All right, guys, that's going to do it for this episode of AK Global. We went through planks 1 through 5 of the Communist Manifesto, detailing out some of that stuff for you. We have recorded the next episode, which is planks 6 through 10, and I'll get that out as soon as I can. Holidays are a little bit slow, and as you can tell, it's been a while between these episodes, but I'm getting them out as fast as I can, and we have a bunch of topics in the hopper ready to go, so make sure you subscribe and share this around to people. Anyways, thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time.